When her wealthy husband died, she didn't just inherit his fortune. She inherited a forbidden, terrifying power. The rumors traveled like a fever across the humid air of the southern town. The patriarch of the Vance estate was dead. His departure created a vacuum far greater than his physical presence, a legacy founded on immense cotton fields, the labor of 1,000 enslaved people, and the muted agony of those forbidden to voice their suffering aloud. He had been among the most affluent men in the territory, a figure of influence and indulgence who seldom soiled his own hands but saw his wealth multiply with every single harvest. Now he was gone, and his widow, Eleanora Vance, remained. The town's hushed conversations spoke her name with a mix of reverence and venom. A woman of incredible beauty and composure, she was now the focal point of an empire she had never been allowed to govern. At the burial, she displayed her mourning with practiced elegance. A black veil, gloved hands, lips quivering with the precise measure of sorrow. But beneath that facade, something different was awakening, something silent and perilous. The other powerful men of the region watched her not with simple condolence, but with shrewd assessment. She was youthful, beautiful, and fantastically wealthy. A widow of her standing did not stay unattached for long, especially not in this society of strategic alliances and marriage contracts presented as affection. Yet Eleanora felt no desire to return to the gilded prison she had just departed. Her husband's passing had left her with more than just assets. It bestowed upon her the most unusual gift a woman of that era could receive: complete control. She was no longer required to defer to anyone, no husband to please, no patriarch to dictate her every action. For the very first time, she could make her own choices. The idea was both exhilarating and deeply frightening. A week following the funeral, she went to the plantations in person. It was her initial visit to those grounds not as a companion, but as the mistress in full authority. The atmosphere was heavy with warmth and the aroma of soil. Overseers stood in a respectful line, hats removed, their gazes sharp with intrigue. The enslaved laborers were arranged in rows, their skins shining with sweat, their expressions impossible to decipher. Eleanora observed their labor, the motion of their hands picking cotton, the way their backs curved under the strain of their tasks, how their silence possessed a resilience she hadn't witnessed before. Her deceased husband had consistently referred to them as chattel, anonymous workers, but standing there, she perceived something else entirely. She saw strength. That evening, sleep eluded her. Her thoughts replayed the sight of those men, their powerful forms, their quiet endurance. It was a vision that disturbed her, yet it also sparked a strange fascination deep within. The following day, she departed from her grand home and traveled to the city's slave market. When questioned about her needs, she stated plainly, household servants, young and strong. By dusk, she had acquired 10 men. Her overseers presumed they were intended for manual labor around the property. They were mistaken. History often portrays the Southern lady as a delicate figure, refined, ethical, and devoid of cruelty. But the reality, as documented by historians like Catherine Clinton and Stephanie Jones Rogers, reveals a starkly different picture. Many white women, particularly widows who inherited vast estates, found a dark form of autonomy in their new positions. No longer constrained by their husbands, they were surrounded by an authority they had never known. Authority over land, over finances, and over the bodies of the enslaved men who attended to them. In the following weeks, Eleanora's estate became a hotbed of quiet conjecture. The household staff observed shifts in her demeanor, her solitary walks through the halls at night, how her newly acquired slaves were lodged near the main house rather than in the distant field quarters. Lamplight burned late into the darkness behind her bedroom windows. Doors would creak open and shut. Heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoed in the stillness. The next morning she would appear composed, peaceful, with a faint glow as if the night had fulfilled a long unanswered need. Was this some form of twisted affection? This was not romance in any conventional sense. It was about dominance, control, and the intoxicating thrill of forbidden power. For the first time, Eleanora could issue commands without facing repercussions. She could call for a man an individual the law deemed less than human, and he would have no alternative but to comply. Yet beneath that power lay something more intricate, more hazardous. A craving, a hunger not just of the flesh, but of the spirit for the freedom and defiance she had always been denied. In those hushed, candlelit evenings, she became ensnared in the very system that oppressed others. Every act of intimacy was poisoned by the grotesque imbalance of power. Power, once tasted, is a difficult poison to refuse. The men she called upon could not say no. To defy her desires meant risking severe punishment, or worse. Their physical strength, which she found so compelling, only served to amplify her own dominance. She confused control with tenderness, commands with connection. The rush of power became her private refuge from the isolation of her widowhood, and in that shadowed realm, desire contorted into something unrecognizable. But secrets of this nature rarely stay buried. The whispers started small. Servants murmuring among themselves, overseers sharing knowing glances. Neighbors remarked on how frequently she dismissed her household staff, how she often went alone to the quarters. They started to question what truly transpired behind the grand white pillars of her mansion. When darkness blanketed the fields, Southern society relied on silence. But silence is a fragile thing when burdened by sin. Eleonora was not the sole widow whose mourning had morphed into something far darker. Across the South, women in similar circumstances, newly liberated and newly powerful, walked the same treacherous path between isolation and desire. Historians like Elizabeth Fox Genovese later identified this as the paradox of the Southern mistress, a woman oppressed by a patriarchal system, yet simultaneously an active participant in the oppression of others. Eleonora's story was not an anomaly, it was merely one of the few that dared to be imagined. By day, she upheld the image of a flawless Southern lady, courteous, cultured, and generous. But as night descended, her reality shifted. Behind the thick draperies and locked doors, she transformed into something her world would never pardon if it discovered the truth. A woman who leveraged her power to violate every boundary established by her society. She felt simultaneously liberated and damned by her urges. What she engaged in secretly became her personal act of rebellion. Yet it also bound her to a guilt she couldn't articulate. In her reflection, she saw the contradiction of her own life, the serene face of a widow, the commanding eyes of a ruler, and the dark shadow of a sinner. She was both sovereign and captive, mighty and helpless all at once. Each night she attempted to seize her own liberty through the subjugation of another. And each morning she awoke to the reality that she existed in a world founded on brutality, secrecy, and falsehoods. History would eventually erase her name, just as it erased the names of countless women like her. The official records mentioned their estates, their fortunes, their periods of mourning, but not the secrets that pulsed within those plantation walls. Still, those secrets persist, whispered across time, interred beneath the sugarcane and cotton fields, where power and desire once converged under the cloak of night. When a widow like Eleonora took possession of a plantation, she also took possession of a world built on hidden truths. The fields murmured with pain. The walls contained narratives that could never be spoken. To exist, there was to inhale both opulence and decay, to grasp that beneath the polished floors and white columns, every breath was scented with control. For women in her position, freedom was not a pure concept. It was steeped in contradiction. She had fled the authority of one man only to uncover a more sinister authority within herself. The South termed it refinement. History would later term it power without conscience. The town's gossip continued to swirl around her estate like birds of prey. Neighbors questioned why she hadn't taken another husband. Suitors visited, men of stature offering security, partnership, and the assurance of returning her to the proper station a woman was expected to occupy. But she turned them all down with a quiet firmness, asserting her wish to honor her late husband's memory. In reality, she had no intention of belonging to another man. She had discovered her own unique form of sovereignty. She was the mistress now, not merely of the land, but of all things within its confines. Yet inside that dominion, she experienced a peculiar division, a hunger and a guilt so deeply enmeshed they became one and the same. At night, the atmosphere in her room felt thick with the phantoms of her decisions. She had transformed her solitude into command, her sorrow into ownership. The very walls that had once enclosed her as a wife now shielded her as something entirely different. There was no husband to question her, no patriarch to judge her. The sole witnesses to her clandestine world were the men she commanded. Historians such as Stephanie Jones Rogers and Catherine Clinton would later uncover proof of this concealed hierarchy of white women who, following their husbands' deaths, assumed control of plantations and started to blur the lines between ownership and obsession. They discovered letters, documents, and testimonies, fragments of a reality too scandalous for open record. These widows were meant to be paragons of purity, preserving the facade of moral high ground that white womanhood symbolized in the slave-holding South. But beneath that veneer, behind locked doors, they indulged the very impulses their society forbade them. Eleonora's nightly encounters evolved into a ritual of control. She learned to navigate the darkness like a specter. Her movements deliberate, her orders soft yet unbreakable. The men she summoned understood the unspoken rules. Say little, obey completely. The air in her chambers was heavy with unvoiced terror. Yet to the outside world, she maintained the perfect image of Southern virtue. She organized gatherings for church groups, gave to orphanages, and penned letters about faith and loss. It was a masterful performance of innocence. But in the shadows, the masks came off. There, stripped of propriety and expectations, Eleonora pursued what she could never attain in the drawing rooms of Charleston or Savannah. A sense of power that was exclusively hers. The thrill of crossing the boundary every Southern woman was taught to fear consumed her. The forbiddance became her solace. Yet each act left her feeling empty, and every morning she looked in the mirror, uncertain if she was empowered or enslaved by her own cravings. For the enslaved men, it was a waking nightmare, a silent violation that had no name. They could not resist, because to refuse a mistress was to invite death. They shouldered the burden of her desires just as they shouldered the burden of labor in the fields. Silently, perpetually, without any hope for freedom. What the world might have termed pleasure was, for them, just another form of servitude. They became the custodians of her secrets, ensnared in a silence that history would never acknowledge. The plantation, with its moonlit hallways and deep shadows, became an emblem of that silence. Servants learned not to probe. Overseers feigned ignorance. The entire system was designed to shield her. White men who harbored suspicions simply looked away. To admit such transgressions would be to admit that the purity of their own race, so aggressively defended in public, was a complete fabrication. In the warped logic of the South, a white man could do as he wished with a black woman. But the notion of a white woman crossing that same line was so unthinkable, it was never spoken of aloud. Among her peers, a tacit agreement existed, a code of silence upheld by fear, pride, and hypocrisy. Other widows lived in the same manner. They also acquired young, powerful men, bringing them close to the main house under the pretense of domestic work. They too discovered comfort in power that masqueraded as passion. At social events, they sometimes exchanged knowing looks, a brief flash of recognition that passed between them like a wisp of smoke. No words were needed because words were a liability. Silence was safer. Silence was survival. As the years went by, Eleonora aged with grace. Her fortune secure, her secret world undisturbed. The fields kept producing their profits. The town kept on whispering, but no one could prove what truly happened within her walls. Her beauty softened, but her authority only grew more acute, more detached. She became a legend among the servants, a figure both feared and pitied. They said her heart had turned to stone years ago, that she slept in the same bed where her husband had passed, surrounded by ghosts of her own creation. When emancipation finally arrived, the old social order disintegrated, and the Vance plantations fell into ruin. The slaves were freed, the overseers departed, and the mansion's splendor began to fade. Eleonora was left alone, her wealth dwindling, her secrets decaying quietly beneath the floorboards. The men who had once been her instruments of power vanished into newfound freedom, leaving her with only the memory of her actions. The silence that had once been her shield now became her prison. Historians seldom speak of her kind. The records of such women were intentionally buried under the weight of propriety and shame. Society opted to forget that in the twisted mechanics of slavery, white women were not merely passive victims of patriarchy, but were also active agents in its cruelties. Their hands too were stained not just with the blood of those they owned, but with darker sins that could never be admitted. The legacy of the plantation mistress was altered to maintain the illusion of innocence. But beneath every history revised by the powerful lies the truth whispered by the oppressed. Eleonora's story, like so many others, was never recorded in ledgers or family Bibles. It endured only in the shadows of memory, in the perceptive eyes of those who once served her, in the uncomfortable quiet that descended whenever her name was spoken. She died as she had lived in silence, surrounded by a fortune that could no longer offer her peace. And when her estate was eventually sold, nobody talked about what had occurred behind those doors. The house was repainted, the walls were mended, the past was covered over with layers of whitewash, both literal and metaphorical. But history has a way of recalling what people try to erase. Beneath the romanticized image of the antebellum South lies the truth of its women. Women who reigned in silence, who wielded desire like a weapon. They found freedom in the chains of others. Who discovered in the suffering of others a mirror of their own broken liberty. Theirs was a dominion built not only on slavery but on secrecy, where the lines between love, control, and cruelty blended into one. If this exploration of hidden history made you think, please press the like button and join us for more at Winds of Thought. In the end, the tale of Eleanor Vance is not merely one woman's downfall. It is the story of an entire era, of a civilization that cloaked its sins in finery and called them virtue, that instructed its daughters to weep in public and sin in private, that built its prosperity on silence and its morality on lies. And though centuries have passed, the echo of that silence still resonates, haunting the soil where the cotton once grew, whispering of the forbidden domain that history attempted and failed to expunge. The past does not vanish. It persists in the earth, in the ruins of old plantation houses, in the bloodlines of the survivors. What transpired in the shadows of the South was not just the story of slavery. It was a story of power, of forbidden appetite, of human desire warped by dominance. Men were bound by iron, women were bound by expectation. And sometimes, when both attempted to break free, their rebellion assumed forms too dark for history to acknowledge. For every widow like Eleonora, there were countless others, unrecorded, unnamed, who governed their silent kingdoms with trembling hands. They lived behind veils of mourning, moving through candlelit corridors where the only witnesses to their sins were the walls themselves. Time buried their confessions and history portrayed them as saints. But the truth cannot be buried forever. It breathes in forgotten records, in the pages of Catherine Clinton and Stephanie Jones Rogers, in memories that refuse to disappear. The plantations are gone now. Their fields have returned to dust, their mansions to relics. But the silence remains. The same silence that kept so many voices unheard, so many truths untold. And when you listen closely to the wind that moves through the South, it still carries the echo,